Gauteng 10-day irregularity scandal involving King Madzikane II Diko, that's the husband of presidency spokesperson Kusela Diko, has fueled discussions over royal households doing business with the state. Now, while it's common for politicians to enjoy close relationships with kings and queens, concerns have been raised over undue influence and even corruption. To help us navigate this territory, so to speak, I'm now joined by royal affairs expert, that's Matthew Mpahlwa. Matthew, thanks for your time and welcome to the AM report. So as a start, perhaps...
Good morning.
Thanks for your time again.
Good morning to you and yours.
Sure. As a start, perhaps let's address what appears to be the sticking issue around this, and this has to do with the legitimacy of King Madzikane. There had been various comments about, not even having an Amapaka king according to South African law, some suggesting in some respects that the king is not a king but is rather a chief. Help us understand the distinction between a king and a chief and why that's important for this discussion.
Well, it is interesting that that debate only emerges only now. But a chief would preside over a particular jurisdiction, limited jurisdiction, under the auspices of a king. You will note that the chief would report to a tribal authority. The tribal authorities will then make the composite of what is known in terms of the law, the King's Council. Now, Unkosum Uthandisizwe Madzikane is a king to those people who regard him as such. And it is now news and with interest that we would read and hear that there are some people questioning his legitimacy. In fact, a king in our customary law is a king to the people. The fact that he is not recognized or recognized by government is neither here nor there.
Is it though? Because we know that these monarchs operate within the state governed by these laws. I'm not pushing back against the perception of the people he leads, but certainly for other people who aren't necessarily involved in that arrangement, making this distinction insofar as the law is concerned is quite important.
You may suggest that because of given the factual metrics or the scenario that we are meant to address, but subject to that before the promulgation of any act of law in the South African system, chiefs and kings were there. You must note and not take this lightly that from time to time, claims about the legitimacy of kingship, claims about the legitimacy of chieftainship have now become an order of the day. So one must be very skeptical in making assertions about legitimacy or not. Because if those people suggest, and I suggest at this stage they are still faceless, that Unkosi Madzikane II is not a king, they must then substantiate their claims with evidence as why they suggest such. And I repeat that if he says he's a king, he's a king to the people that he presides upon, and respectfully so. Amabaka people recognize him as such, and that shall not change, and it will remain as such. And I say the recognition of chiefs and kings has been a long debate. I know, for instance, in the bulk of the Eastern Cape, there is by far a majority of chiefs who are not registered or are not salaried by government, but still preside over their areas and have authority in their jurisdictions. So the fact that they are not recognized by a statutory framework or in terms of the law does not make them lesser of a king or a chief in that instance.
That's incredibly interesting because it does throw into question decisions made by the state and the relationship that it has with the monarchs that it recognizes. But nonetheless, let's come to the substantive issues that we're hoping to unpack today, and that is to do with these transactions that we understand to have taken place between any royal household and government. The optics on the face of it can raise a lot of questions about whether there's undue influence when that kind of transaction takes place. But can we imagine a scenario where royal households doing business with government is not problematic?
I must start that with an assertion that some royal households or royal families, for the longest of times, have done business with government. This is nothing new. I must draw you back in history, where one would look at the establishment of cooperatives in communities, agricultural cooperatives, where one would look at mining ventures. In the majority of those cooperatives or agricultural projects or mining ventures, the royal households are ipso facto involved. If any evaluation has to be carried out, one has to have regard to the factual metrics here at play. And it forces, the factual metrics here at play, it forces one to adopt a two-stage inquiry, and I propose this two-stage inquiry to you for the following reasons. It is important to determine, first and foremost, whether it can be said in this instance that it was in fact the Mabaka kingdom which did business or made a bid to government. Or in the alternative, whether it is a member or a leader of the royal family, which is in this case a king, who is doing business with government. There seems to be an assertion when I read his statement that the proceeds of such a venture or a business were to benefit, in the final analysis, members of his institution in the traditional leadership community that which he presides on. But there is nothing peculiar with traditional leaders, princes, queens, and royal families doing government with business, provided that the stringent conditions of procurement are met, provided that there does not exist a perception, and I suggest in this instance that it is a perception which is at issue at this stage.
Of course it is.
I make that suggestion.
Yeah, sorry to come in there. Of course it's the perception that's the issue here, because the position has many suggestions, and I guess it's in that respect that we'll have to wait for the investigation to reach its final conclusion. But you mentioned the statement that the king had released, and many people will push back against the assertion that you're making, that these proceeds will go to the people to which he leads. Again, that was largely expected, and in fact the public has no reason to believe that to be true. Why should the public believe that this wasn't going to personally benefit him, especially given the proximity he has to the presidency through his wife, Kusela Diko?
I will first acknowledge that assertion and that understanding of the statement. Perhaps the statement says more, or maybe the absence of various assertions makes the statement questionable, or makes the statement to make people to doubt. The reason I say that, the absence of some assertions in the statement that where the proceeds will go, because if one look at the registration of this company, it's between two individuals. Now, in that statement, His Majesty Thandi Sizwe commences by indicating the circumstances of the bid. He then goes on to talk about the perceived perception or the public outrage. He then goes on to speak about business with the Masukus. Now, at no point does he allege that this company has been formed by the Bata royal family. At no point does he suggest in the statement that the directorship of the company is that which is under the auspices of the royal family. At no point also does he suggest that this company, in fact, proceeds in likelihood as they come will go to the royal family or the leadership thereof.
Yeah.
It would seem that the absence of those suggestions, then this is a private company with a business interest.
Absolutely.
In its own right.
And we also not told about the history of the company in and of itself, which, according to some reports, suggests it was only started in November last year and has no track record of ever being used to procure PPE. And again, at the level of perception, it leaves a lot to be desired. But there's more to this. There's also questions about why it is that the King would do business with the Gauteng government in particular, and not the Eastern Cape government that serves the people he leads. What's your take on that?
I know of not when this story came out, I raised my 10 fingers and I said, I know of more than 10 princes, kings and queens who have over the last 10 years engaged in government business in their own right. There is nothing wrong with King Madzikane engaging in business in his own right as a person. The kingdom of Mpahlwa will not swim or sink with him. The kingdom is not umbilically connected to him. He is at his own goodwill extend the benefits to the kingdom. There are many princes that I know who sit as members of or executive board members of many companies, registered companies, and queens as well, and chiefs as well. And then the same people who would then go and sit in parliament. You would find that as they sit in these executive directors in these companies then in turn do business with government. But no one over the last 10 years or 20 years has ever cautioned or questioned that.
Yeah, but
they are doing business in their own right, and if all the legalities have been met insofar as the procurement is concerned, then there is nothing untoward in respect of that tender until we are provided the contrary.
Yeah. Very quickly, because we are out of time, surely something has to be said about the proximity to power that they have insofar as their relationship with government. Can we acknowledge at least that on the face of it very quickly?
Indeed, this is now what I propose to you, being to the second leg of the inquiry, the perception. I fully agree with the statement made by Udlovukazi Udiko and Unkosi Uthandisizwe in asserting that it was an error of judgment. And in so doing, they are dealing with a perception, and the perception remains a perception. At some point, maybe nothing turns to that, but these people have not simply then, when a perception cannot be viewed in a vacuum. Once the perception was there, what did they do? They took special leave, they offered a statement, there was a cancellation of the bid or the cancellation of the tender. These are honorable steps that in the past in South Africa we have not seen. Right. So we then must begin to read into the conduct of these people, who they then say then come out to the public, we have not benefited any single cent, and the minute the perception was there, we did something about it. That is honorable.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there.
Dealing with the perception, the ANC Integrity Committee is there.
Sure.
And the preliminary investigations must then be there to establish whether there was anything untoward or illegal with the procurement in respect of this matter.